Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, winter 1985. The boardwalk is frozen under a pale gray sky. Snow collects along the railings, untouched except for the scuff marks of heavy boots. The Atlantic turns dark and cold beyond the sand. Neon signs flicker in Cyrillic above storefronts, restaurants, delis, pawn shops. Russian voices carry through the wind, sharp and unfamiliar to the old neighborhood. Inside a basement social club on Brighton Beach Avenue, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and tension. A group of men sit around a folding table. Some wear leather jackets. Others, wool overcoats still damp from the snow. Their faces are hard, carved by winters harsher than this one. They speak in low tones, not in English, not in Italian, in Russian. Across the borough, in a different kind of club, men in tailored suits sip espresso and discuss a problem. A new problem, the Russians, they don't ask permission, they don't show respect, they don't follow the rules. And that, in the world of organized crime, is more dangerous than any weapon. To understand how the Russian Mafia and the American mob collided in New York, you have to go back to the beginning. To the arrivals. To the émigrés who came with nothing but scars, secrets, and survival instincts forged in the coldest corners of the Soviet Union. In the late 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union entered a brief thaw in relations. Between 1975 and 1985, more than 100,000 Soviet émigrés arrived on American shores. Most were legitimate refugees, families seeking freedom, opportunity, a new life. But among them, hidden in the tide of the desperate and the hopeful, came another kind of immigrant. Criminals, not petty thieves or street hustlers. These were men who had survived the Soviet Gulag system, men branded with ink and bound by codes older than the regime itself. They were Vory v. Zakone, thieves-in-law, an elite criminal brotherhood born in Stalin's labor camps. In the Gulag, where the state controlled everything, the Vory controlled the shadows. Tattoos marked their rank, their crimes, their loyalty. A dagger through the neck meant a murderer. Stars on the knees meant they bowed to no one. When the gates opened, some of these men saw an opportunity. The Soviet Union was a prison. America was a frontier. They landed in New York. Most settled in Brighton Beach, a fading seaside neighborhood in southern Brooklyn. By the early 1980s, locals had begun calling it Little Odessa. Russian became the dominant language. On the surface, it looked like any other immigrant enclave, hardworking families building a future. But beneath that surface, something else was taking root. The émigrés brought with them a deep distrust of authority. In the Soviet Union, the police were the enemy. Informants were everywhere. The state was a predator, so they learned to handle problems themselves. This mentality, carried across the ocean, became the foundation of what would later be called the Organizatsiya, the Russian Mafia. At first, the crimes were small: welfare fraud, Medicare scams. But the men behind these schemes were not amateurs. They had operated in a system where getting caught meant death or decades in Siberia. Compared to the KGB, the NYPD was a minor inconvenience, and they were fearless. In the Soviet Union, violence was a language everyone understood. A beating was a message. A murder was a resolution. There were no lawyers, no trials, no appeals. There was only action and consequence. The men who came from that world brought that logic with them. They didn't negotiate. They didn't warn. They acted. By the mid-1980s, Russian criminal networks in Brighton Beach had grown more sophisticated. They controlled gas stations, running bootleg fuel scams that defrauded the government of millions. They extorted local businesses, targeting their own community first, Russian shop owners who knew better than to call the police. The money flowed, the operations expanded, and eventually, inevitably, they began to cross paths with the other power in New York's underworld, the Italian-American Mafia. The Italian-American Mafia in the 1980s was still the dominant force in organized crime. The five families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno, controlled labor unions, construction, garbage collection, the waterfront, loan sharking, gambling, and drug trafficking. They had money, they had influence. They had politicians, judges, and police officers on their payroll, and they had rules. The mafia operated on a code. Omerta, the code of silence. Loyalty to the family above all, respect for hierarchy. You didn't kill without permission. You didn't encroach on another family's territory without a sit-down. Violence was used strategically. As a last resort, the mafia prided itself on being organized, professional, disciplined. This was the world the Russians stepped into, and they had no idea how it worked. To the Italians, the Russians were outsiders. They didn't understand the protocols. They didn't send emissaries. They didn't ask permission. They simply moved in, set up operations, and started making money. The Italians noticed. At first, they didn't see the Russians as a serious threat. They were immigrants, refugees. They spoke broken English. They had no political connections, no deep roots in the city. How much damage could they really do? But then the stories started coming in. A Russian crew had taken over a piece of the gasoline bootlegging business. They weren't paying tribute. They weren't asking to partner. They were just doing it. A sit-down had been arranged to settle a dispute. The Russians came. They listened. Then they ignored everything that was said and did what they wanted anyway. To the Italians, this was madness. These people had no structure, no honor, no respect for the way things were done. But to the Russians, the Italians were soft. They talked too much. They hid behind lawyers and front companies. In the Soviet Union, you survived by being harder, faster, more brutal than everyone else. Politeness was a weakness. Negotiation was a trap. The Italians believed in diplomacy. If there was a problem, you sat down, you talked, you worked it out. Business was business. Violence was expensive. The Russians believed in dominance. If there was a problem, you made an example. You showed strength. You made people afraid. Fear was cheaper than loyalty. The FBI and NYPD were watching both groups, but they understood the Italians. There were decades of wiretaps, informants, case files. The Russians were a mystery. They had no clear structure, no single boss. They operated in loose networks, bound by nationality, language, and personal loyalty rather than formal family ties. They used codes the FBI couldn't crack, and they were extraordinarily violent. Not the calculated, mob-hit violence of a professional assassin, but chaotic, brutal, public violence. A man would be beaten with a baseball bat in front of witnesses. A car would be firebombed in the middle of the day. The Russians didn't care about being subtle. The publicity was part of the strategy. It sent a message: we are not afraid. By 1985, the two groups were operating in the same city, in overlapping industries, with completely incompatible philosophies. Something had to give, and it did. The spark came in 1986. A sit-down was arranged, not a casual meeting but a formal negotiation. The location was neutral, a social club in Brooklyn. The participants were mid-level but influential. Representatives from the Gambino family on one side and a group of Russian operators on the other. The issue was the gasoline bootlegging business. The Russians had expanded aggressively, cutting into profits the Gambinos considered theirs. The Italians wanted tribute. In return, they would offer protection, connections, a place within the broader structure of New York's underworld. The Russians listened. One of them, a man named Marat Balagula, did most of the talking. Balagula was a shrewd operator, a businessman who understood both worlds. He had come from Odessa in the late 1970s, settled in Brighton Beach, and quickly built a network of gasoline scams, insurance fraud, and extortion. So he nodded, he was polite, he agreed to the terms, and then he walked out of that club and did nothing. No tribute was paid, no acknowledgement was made. The Russian operations continued to expand. The Italians were confused. Then they were angry. A second meeting was arranged. This time, the tone was different. The Gambino representatives made it clear this was not a negotiation. This was a warning: pay or face consequences. Balagula again agreed. And again, nothing happened. The Italians sent enforcers to Brighton Beach. A Russian-owned gas station was vandalized. A delivery truck was hijacked. The Russian response was immediate and disproportionate. One of the Italian enforcers was attacked outside a bar in Gravesend. Not a clean hit. He was beaten with tire irons, left in the street, broken but alive. The Italians were stunned. You didn't do this. You didn't escalate without permission from the bosses. You didn't make it public. But the Russians did. And that's when the Italians realized these people were not going to play by the rules. The Gambino family held an internal meeting. Some argued for war, hit them hard, make an example. Others argued for caution. The Russians were unpredictable. They were violent. They had nothing to lose. A war would be costly, bloody, and visible. And there was another factor, fear. Because the Russians didn't fight like the Italians, they didn't follow the old rules of engagement. Collateral damage was not a concern. The Italians made a decision. They would not go to war. Instead, they would isolate the Russians, cut them off from larger opportunities. But they would not provoke them. It was a strategic retreat, and the Russians noticed. The retreat did not go unnoticed on the streets. When the Gambinos stepped back, even slightly, it sent a signal. The Russians could be dealt with, but they could not be controlled. Other Italian families took note. They adjusted their strategies. If the Russians wanted Brighton Beach, they could have it. As long as they stayed in their lane, there would be no open conflict. But the Russians had no interest in staying in their lane. Emboldened, they expanded. Not just in Brooklyn, but into Manhattan, Queens, even New Jersey. They diversified. Extortion, credit card fraud, drug trafficking, money laundering. They partnered with other immigrant criminal groups. They built a network that was international, decentralized, and incredibly profitable. By the late 1980s, the Russian Mafia was no longer a curiosity. It was a power. The world changed. By the mid-1990s, the landscape of organized crime in New York bore little resemblance to the one that had existed a decade earlier. The Italian-American Mafia was in decline. Aggressive federal prosecutions under RICO statutes, high-profile trials, and a generational shift had weakened it irreparably. Into this vacuum, the Russians expanded. They took over rackets the Italians could no longer protect. Gasoline bootlegging became almost entirely Russian-controlled. They moved into healthcare fraud. They laundered money on a scale the Italians had never achieved. The Italian Mafia's response was pragmatic. In some areas, they partnered with the Russians. In others, they simply withdrew. There were no grand battles, just a slow, quiet ceding of territory. Law enforcement was forced to adapt. The FBI's Russian Organized Crime Task Force grew throughout the 1990s, but prosecutions were difficult. The Russians were experts at compartmentalization. Money trails were convoluted. Witnesses were terrified. By the end of the 1990s, the Russian Mafia had firmly established itself as a permanent fixture of organized crime in America. They controlled significant portions of gasoline bootlegging, healthcare fraud, money laundering, and cybercrime. They had become international. Russian criminal networks stretched from New York to Los Angeles, from Miami to London, from Tel Aviv to Moscow. The Italian-American Mafia, by contrast, was a shadow of its former self. It still existed, still operated, but it no longer dominated. The Russians had not destroyed the Mafia, but they had proven that the Mafia's world, its codes, its structures, its assumptions, was not the only way to operate. And in doing so, they had changed organized crime forever. History is written by survivors, and in the underworld, survival is not about virtue. It is about adaptability. The Italian-American Mafia survived for generations because it understood how to adapt to American society. It learned the language, corrupted the institutions, built alliances, and operated with a veneer of respectability. The Russian Mafia survived because it understood how to thrive in chaos. It had no interest in respectability, no patience for diplomacy, no faith in institutions. It operated with a brutal efficiency born from surviving the worst system the 20th century had to offer. When these two forces met in New York in the 1980s, the collision was not just a territorial dispute. It was a clash of philosophies, one rooted in tradition, the other in survival, one believing in structure, the other in chaos. The Russians did not defeat the Mafia, but they changed it. They forced it to recognize that the old rules were not universal. That fear could be more powerful than respect. That unpredictability could be a strategy. Today, both groups still exist. The Mafia, smaller and more cautious. The Russians, more global and sophisticated. They coexist, sometimes cooperate, sometimes compete. But the lessons remain. In the shadows of New York, in the basements of Brighton Beach, in the memory of those who were there, the story endures. Two worlds collided. One was never the same. The other was born from the collision. And the underworld learned to speak a new language.